She was the wealthiest woman in America, and she left the government a palace by the sea. But in 1980, the United States did something almost unthinkable. It gave Mar-a-Lago back. Too expensive to keep, too complicated to protect. A gift returned to sender. A returned gift sounds like a punchline, but it is a real historical tragedy. Because for Marjorie Merriweather Post, Mar-a-Lago was not just a house. It was the ending she tried to write for her own legacy and for her country. And the moment the government refused that ending, the palace began to rewrite the story of the woman who built it. Chapter 1. The island that learned how to sell a dream. Start with ocean light and silence. Palm Beach is a thin strip of land between two bodies of water. On one side, the Atlantic. On the other, the Lake Worth Lagoon. In the early days, it was mostly sand, scrub, heat, insects, and distance. The place did not become famous because it was easy. It became famous because Americans in the Gilded Age were inventing a new religion. Leisure. Not rest. Not peace. Leisure as proof. Palm Beach grew up with stories the way resort towns always do. One local tale talks about in 1878 shipwreck and coconuts washing ashore. Thousands of them, planted into the sand until palms multiplied. Whether the details are exact or not, the point is clear. Palm Beach wanted to look like somewhere else. Somewhere warmer. Somewhere effortless. Somewhere that allowed the richest people in the country to pretend winter had been canceled. Then a man arrived who understood how to turn a fantasy into infrastructure. Henry Morrison Flagler helped build the American empire of rail and oil. He understood a blunt truth. If you make it possible to arrive, people will arrive. He extended rail lines down Florida. He built hotels that could hold the new elite. He created a pipeline for comfort, a route in, a reason to stay. Palm Beach became a stage, and the richest Americans became the actors. By the 1920s, the season was not only a vacation, it was a competition, a parade of houses and parties, a public display where architecture was another way to say, I am winning. The island was ready for a monument, and the person who would build it was not a man. It was a woman with more money than most dynasties, and a talent for turning private space into public influence. Chapter 2. The Heiress Who Would Not Live Quietly. Marjorie Merriweather Post was born in 1887. She grew up watching her father, C.W. Post, turn packaged food into an empire. He believed in selling health, energy, modern life, all wrapped in a brand. He was not old money. He was American money. Built fast, built loud, built with belief. When he died in 1914, Marjorie inherited the fortune. Overnight, she became one of the richest women in the United States. For much of her life, she was described as the wealthiest woman in America. But she did not treat wealth as a glass case. She treated it as an engine. Even before Mar-a-Lago, Post was known for using her fortune publicly. During the First World War, she funded support for American soldiers overseas, including medical facilities. Later in life, France honored her with the Legion of Honor for her wartime and charitable work. These details matter because they show she was always thinking beyond her own doorstep. She wanted her money to mean something outside her name. She stayed connected to the business that would eventually become General Foods. She served in leadership roles for years at a time when most women were expected to stay away from corporate decisions. She learned the language of balance sheets and acquisitions. She learned how influence is built, not only inherited. Her personal life did not move in a straight line. She married 4 times across her lifetime. Each marriage placed her in new circles and new expectations, and each ending reinforced the same lesson. If she wanted stability, she would have to build it herself. And she understood the second language of power early. Rooms. In the early 20th century, rooms mattered. Who could enter? Who was seated near whom? Who could be seen? Who could be heard? If you wanted alliances, you did not just buy them. You hosted them. Marjorie Post became a master hostess because she understood what hosting really was. A form of control that looked like generosity. A way to guide relationships without ever giving an order. A way to make a guest feel chosen, and therefore loyal. That skill is often written off as social life. It was not. It was strategy, and it would shape the most expensive decision of her life. Chapter 3. The Food Empire and the Training of a Builder. Before we return to Palm Beach, pause on the part of her life that made Marjorie Post different from a simple socialite. She was rich, yes, but she was also embedded in the machinery that produced modern America. Packaged food was one of the quiet revolutions of the 20th century. It turned distant farms into predictable products. It turned meals into brands. It created a national taste. The same box on the shelf, in every city, Post lived inside that revolution. She sat at tables where decisions were made, not only invitations issued. She watched how systems scale, how a small idea becomes a national habit, how distribution becomes power. That experience left marks on how she built everything else. Because a company is a structure, it has departments and corridors and hidden work. It has a visible front and an invisible engine. Mar-a-Lago would be built the same way. A glamorous face, a massive hidden system behind it. And there is another lesson business teaches. If you want a story to last, you must pay for its maintenance. In the early years, Post could do that easily. Her fortune was not just money sitting in a vault. It was connected to a giant commercial engine. So, when she chose to spend on architecture, she did not spend like a tourist. She spent like someone investing in a permanent brand. That is the crucial irony. The same mind that understood systems would later build a palace whose system was too large for any normal owner to sustain, including, eventually, the nation itself. Chapter 4. Florida Fever, and a piece of land that felt like destiny. To understand why Mar-a-Lago happened, you have to understand the mood of the 1920s. This was the decade when America believed the future would always get brighter. Stock markets surged, consumer culture exploded, cars multiplied, radio made celebrity feel intimate. The country felt young and fast. Florida became a national obsession. Land speculation surged. Developers promised paradise. Newspapers fed the frenzy with photographs of beaches and bright hotels. People arrived with cash and left with deeds. Palm Beach, in particular, became a winter capital for the elite. A place where money did not hide. Money performed. Houses were not built to shelter. They were built to announce. Marjorie Post did not want a winter home that looked like a compromise. She wanted a statement that matched her scale. She found a rare stretch of land, roughly 17 acres, spanning from ocean to lagoon, sea to lake. The geography itself sounded complete, like a world with edges. That is where the name came from. Mar-a-Lago, from sea to lake, and the land carried an additional temptation. Water on both sides means the sky feels bigger. The light feels sharper. The horizon feels like a stage backdrop. Post did not want to place a normal house on that land. A normal house would look apologetic. She wanted something that would make the land feel inevitable, as if it had been waiting for the building all along. To do that, she needed artists of illusion. Chapter 5. The architect, the theater designer, and the palace that never stopped costing money. Construction began around 1924. Florida was glamour, but Florida was also storms. If you wanted permanence, you had to build against wind and salt and sudden violence. Post hired architect Marion Sims Wyeth. Then she hired Joseph Urban, a theatrical designer famous for creating worlds on stage. That detail is the key. Urban did not think in furniture. He thought in scenes. He thought in movement. He thought in emotional pacing. He knew how to guide an audience from one reveal to the next. Post reportedly spent about $7 million in the 1920s. Even then, it was a number that sounded unreal. A figure that turns a building into a headline. Mar-a-Lago rose in Mediterranean revival style. Arcas, loggias, courtyards, long corridors designed to catch sea air, interior spaces arranged for drama, outdoor spaces arranged for procession. Accounts of the estate often emphasize reinforcement and hurricane resistance. The idea was simple. Post did not want a seasonal fantasy that could be erased by a single storm. She wanted something that would still be standing when everyone else stopped talking. By 1927, the mansion was complete. More than 100 rooms, often described as around 126. A property so large it behaved like a small city. It required staff the way a ship requires crew. Here is the detail most stories leave out. A palace is not just the building. A palace is the system required to keep it alive. Kitchens require constant supplies. Gardens require constant labor. Mechanical systems require constant repair. And an ocean climate never stops testing every surface. Post built Mar-a-Lago to feel like permanence. But permanence is never a feeling. It is a budget. Chapter 6. The machine that turned wealth into power. In your mind, step through the entrance. Cool floor, A corridor that narrows, then opens into space. A courtyard that frames the sky. A sequence of reveals, each one designed to make a guest feel something before they say anything. This was not decoration. It was psychology. A guest at Mar-a-Lago did not just visit a home. They walked into a story about Marjorie Post. Here is how much I can command. Here is how carefully I can orchestrate your experience. Here is how comfortable I can make you, while still reminding you whose world this is. Behind that visible world was an invisible one. Cooks, cleaners, gardeners, drivers, attendants, managers, people who woke before sunrise so the palace could look effortless at lunch. Now put yourself in the Palm Beach season. Cars arriving in a line, dress coats, perfume, polished shoes, music in a room with ceilings high enough to swallow the sound. A hostess who knows every name, every marriage, every rivalry, every ambition, and uses the seating chart like a chessboard. Post used Mar-a-Lago as a social engine. She filled it with the people who mattered and the people who wanted to matter. She understood that dinners were negotiations and parties were maps. She used hospitality as a form of soft power, shaping connections the way a strategist shapes a board. She also understood a harsh American rule. To stay powerful, you must appear generous. Post gave to charities and causes across her life. She donated money, built projects, supported institutions. Her philanthropy helped create a public image that matched her private scale. But even in the best years, the palace had a weakness. Coastal Florida never sleeps. Salt air corrodes metal. Humidity swells wood. Storm season threatens everything exposed. Every month produces a new maintenance problem. In the prosperous years, Post could win that fight. She had resources, and she had a reason. The palace was her instrument. Then the country changed. Not slowly, suddenly. Chapter 7. The Great Depression and the Price of Looking Unbroken. When the Great Depression hit, America changed. For many families, survival became the only narrative. For the wealthy, the question became more complicated. How do you stay rich in a country that is suffering? How do you keep your place without looking cruel? Post responded with philanthropy on a scale that became part of her identity. Accounts of her life describe her financing a Salvation Army feeding station in New York during the Depression and personally supervising aspects of it. Whether she was in the public eye or not, she behaved like someone who believed money should move, not sit still. But a palace does not disappear during a crisis. Mar-a-Lago still required staff. It still required repairs. It still required constant attention in an environment that tried to wear it down. This is the uncomfortable secret of large monuments. They force you to keep paying for the appearance of stability. Once you build a palace, stepping away becomes a public statement. If you let it decay, the world reads it as decline. So Post kept the lights on. She kept the system functioning. And she learned, slowly, the truth that would later break her ending. A palace can become a hungry animal. The larger it is, the harder it is to feed. Chapter 8. Moscow and the Education of a Hostess. To understand why Post later tried to give Mar-a-Lago to the nation, you have to see what she learned outside Palm Beach. In 1935, she married her third husband, Joseph E. Davies, a lawyer and diplomat close to Franklin D. Roosevelt. In 1936, he became the United States ambassador to the Soviet Union. Post went with him to Moscow. Moscow, in the late 1930s, was not a resort. It was cold, watched, and tense. It was a city where fear sat in the corners of rooms. A city where the wrong remark could carry consequences. The American ambassador lived at Spaso House, a grand residence used for diplomacy. Post helped turn that residence into a place where America could be felt without speeches. Through hospitality, through dinners, through a warm room in a cold city. Imagine the discipline required. In Palm Beach, a party was a celebration. In Moscow, a dinner was a balancing act. Picture Spaso House lit from within, a warm island in a winter city. American staff moving quietly, silver polished, linens pressed, the room staged to feel calm. Guests arriving with careful smiles, diplomats and officials measuring each other before the first course. Post understood that small details could do what speeches could not. A well-timed toast could soften a room. A well-placed seat could create a channel for conversation. And a beautiful setting could remind everyone that cultures are older than governments. You choose a menu while the city outside tightens its grip. You place guests at a table while every guest wonders who is listening. You keep conversation light enough to survive, but meaningful enough to matter. In that environment, hosting became more than social. It became symbolic. A table set with care could signal stability. A gathering could create a space where conversation was possible, even when nations distrusted each other. This period also shaped her as a collector. During those years, the Soviet government sold objects from the imperial past for hard currency. Post acquired extraordinary pieces of Russian art and decorative objects. Later, much of that collection would live at Hillwood, her Washington estate, and it would help define her reputation as a patron of art and history. In Moscow, Post learned something that stayed with her. A building can represent a country. An official residence is not just a house. It is an instrument of state. It projects identity, continuity, and power. When she returned to America, she carried that lesson. And when she looked again at Mar-a-Lago, she began to imagine it as more than a private palace. Chapter 9. Hillwood and the Idea of Permanence. Post did not only collect objects, she collected entire eras. Art collecting at her level is not only taste, it is a philosophy. If you buy a single beautiful piece, it can be admired. If you build a coherent collection, it becomes a story. That is why Hillwood matters. In Washington, Post created an environment for her collections to live together. Imperial Russian pieces that carried the weight of a fallen court. French decorative art that carried the weight of another world of power and ritual. Hillwood would later open as a museum. That is a clue to how Post thought about legacy. She did not want her life to evaporate into auctions and private sales. She wanted continuity. Mar-a-Lago, in her imagination, could become another kind of continuity. Not a museum, but a working symbol. A residence used by the American state, a place where diplomacy could happen in a setting designed for ceremony. In other words, she wanted Mar-a-Lago to become an official room for the country itself. A second stage for America, set in winter light. It is a powerful idea. It is also a dangerous idea, because it assumes the country will want to pay for the stage. Chapter 10. The legacy plan that made sense only in her mind. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Mar-a-Lago received historic recognition. By 1969, it had been designated a National Historic Site. It was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1972. And in 1980, it was named a National Historic Landmark. Those labels changed its meaning. They suggested Mar-a-Lago belonged to the story of the country, not only to one woman. Post was nearing the end of her life. She had built, collected, hosted, given, and she faced the question that haunts every builder. What happens when I am not here to keep paying? She arranged for Mar-a-Lago to be bequeathed to the federal government after her death. The intention was that it could serve as a presidential and diplomatic retreat, a place for state visits, a winter setting for American hospitality at the highest level. It was a bold, almost royal gesture, but it was also deeply American. A private fortune turned into a public symbol, a palace turned into national infrastructure, a personal monument turned into a tool of diplomacy. Post believed the United States should have more than one place to host the world. Camp David offered isolation and security, but it was inland and private. Mar-a-Lago offered winter sun and ocean air, a setting that could turn diplomacy into ceremony. In her mind, foreign leaders would remember the light, the gardens, the controlled elegance. They would remember America as confident and welcoming. But here was the institutional reality she could not control. Presidents already had established patterns and established locations. A new retreat would need not only a building, but a justification in an existing system. If the government accepted and used it, Post would not only be remembered as a wealthy heiress, she would be remembered as the woman who gave America a stage. The problem was simple. A stage still needs crews, budgets, and security. A gift does not come free, especially when it sits between ocean and lagoon. Chapter 11. The Winter White House That Never Was. Post imagined Mar-a-Lago as a living stage for American diplomacy, a place where the United States could host state visits and quiet meetings under winter sun. The idea had logic. Palm Beach was already a capital of wealth and influence. It already had the hotels, the staff, the transportation, the social muscle to support a large residence. And Mar-a-Lago had been designed for ceremony, for procession, for the slow reveal of rooms that make guests feel small in the presence of power. But presidential life is not shaped by architecture alone. It is shaped by habits, schedules, and risk. By the time the government inherited Mar-a-Lago, the United States already had patterns for presidential retreat. There were places designed specifically for security and privacy. In the early 1970s, for example, President Nixon frequently used the Key Biscayne compound in Florida, a retreat already shaped by presidential routines. There were properties where perimeters could be controlled and routes could be cleared. There were routines that did not require inventing an entire new operational system in a coastal resort town. And there was another quiet problem. A public retreat becomes a public responsibility. If a president stays there, the place becomes a target. If foreign leaders visit, the place becomes an international event. A single weekend requires planning, staffing, and protection at a scale the public rarely sees. Mar-a-Lago was beautiful, but it was also sprawling. A long coastline edge, a lagoon edge, a neighborhood nearby. Too many angles, too many distances to cover. In Post's mind, the palace would make the country look confident. In the government's mind, the palace would make the country vulnerable. And vulnerability has a price. So the Winter White House never happened. Not because the dream was foolish, but because the machine required to run the dream was too heavy. A palace can be a symbol. A presidency is a schedule. Chapter 12, 1973. The gift arrives, and reality arrives after it. Marjorie Merriweather Post died on the 12th of September 1973. She was 86. Her life had been a long exercise in building, collecting, and hosting. And now the loudest room she ever built became quiet. After her death, the federal government inherited Mar-a-Lago, along with the responsibility. At first glance, it sounded glamorous. A palace in Palm Beach, a potential retreat, a ready-made symbol. Then reality arrived. A presidential retreat is not merely a pretty place. It is a system, communications, controlled access, secure perimeters, staffing, medical support, protection teams, logistics, the ability to shut the world out on command. Mar-a-Lago had not been designed for that kind of control. It was designed for openness and flow. Long corridors, many doors, many rooms. Beautiful for hosting, risky for modern security. And the bills did not pause for symbolism. Upkeep costs were enormous. The estate needed constant maintenance. Coastal humidity and salt do not care about historic designation. They keep working. Presidents did not use Mar-a-Lago as Post had imagined. The property remained more idea than instrument. And in government, an unused asset that costs a fortune becomes a problem. Soon the question stopped being romantic. It became bureaucratic. What do you do with a gift that a budget cannot justify? Chapter 13. The Audit of a Dream. At this point, the story becomes colder. Not because anyone is cruel, but because institutions have rules. A government cannot maintain a property simply because it is beautiful. It must explain the spending. It must justify the security plan. It must defend every dollar to the public and to oversight. Mar-a-Lago passed through layers of federal review and planning. Even with historic status, the government would have needed a clear management structure and a clear mission. Advisory discussions could not change the physical truth of the site. It was sprawling, open, and designed for flowing guests, not controlled perimeters. Mar-a-Lago was built like a poem, not like a fortress. It had too many entrances and too many sight lines, too many places where a person could slip away, too many places where a threat could hide, and the location itself created a problem. Between ocean and lagoon, the estate sat in a place that was hard to lock down without changing its nature. To secure it the way a modern retreat requires would mean fences, checkpoints, restricted zones, and a constant presence of protection. It would mean turning a palace designed for openness into a controlled compound. Even then, the costs would not stop, because Mar-a-Lago did not only need security, it needed caretaking, staffing and repairs, insurance and upkeep, the endless fight against corrosion, moisture, and weather. So the dreams stalled, and stalled dreams do not stay neutral. They become liabilities. Chapter 14. Etusine onihundra of Heiress, Return to Seno. On the 23rd of December 1980, Congress passed an act that ended federal responsibility for Mar-a-Lago and provided for its transfer away from the government. In practical terms, it set the return in motion. The transfer was completed in 1981, and the palace went back to the Post Foundation. That is the moment the story snaps. Post had tried to write a final chapter where the nation adopted her monument, where the palace became public purpose, where her name and the American state were linked through hospitality. But the nation looked at the costs, the security complexity, the operational demands, and chose a different ending. Return to sender. Even if Post did not live to hear those words, history did. A palace offered to the country, a palace given back. This is why Mar-a-Lago feels like a curse in narrative terms. It turns generosity into burden. It turns a grand gesture into a refusal. And it turns the builder into someone whose greatest work could not find a home in the very nation she hoped to serve. Now the Post Foundation owned a palace again, not as a cherished private home, as a liability. Chapter 15, The Foundation Trap and the Years When the Palace Almost Vanished. In the early 1980s, Mar-a-Lago became a famous kind of impossible asset, too large to be a private home for most buyers, too expensive to run as a museum without a steady endowment, too valuable to abandon, and too costly to keep. The Post Foundation was not a government agency. It did not have federal budgets. It did not have a permanent security apparatus. It could not declare the palace essential and force the country to pay for it. It faced the kind of problem that feels almost unfair. A priceless building can be a financial emergency. Beauty does not pay for electricians. History does not repair roofs. Imagine the conversations behind closed doors. If we open it to the public, who pays the staff? If we keep it private, who pays the repairs? If we sell it, who protects the history? If we do not sell it, what happens when the next storm arrives? Without consistent use and funding, a great building begins to deteriorate. Not from malice, from time, paint peels, leaks spread, gardens lose their precision, staff shrinks, the silence changes, and in a coastal estate, neglect is not quiet. It is loud. It shows up as rust on gates, salt stains on stone, and damp creeping behind walls. It shows up as a roof repair that cannot wait, even if the bank account wants it to. It shows up as a storm forecast that turns into a business meeting. Do we board up windows? Do we hire extra hands? Do we risk damage because we cannot afford prevention? Historic status can protect a building, but it can also complicate decisions. When a place is recognized as significant, changes are questioned. Repairs must respect materials. Alterations must respect design. And every careful choice costs more. A simple fix becomes a specialized contract. A quick replacement becomes a restoration. This is how a palace traps its caretaker. You cannot let it fall, because it is history. You cannot easily change it, because it is history. And you cannot comfortably sell it, because it is history. History becomes a gate that swings in only one direction. Toward more responsibility, the foundation reportedly sought buyers and struggled. A property like Mar-a-Lago is not a normal listing. Its uniqueness is both the attraction and the trap. It comes with history, constraints, and immense operating costs. The pool of potential buyers is tiny. The pool of buyers who want it and can keep it alive is smaller still. Pressure builds in a predictable way. Each month adds costs. Each season adds wear, and the longer a monumental property sits, the more plausible the unthinkable becomes. Demolition. Not because someone hates history, but because someone needs an exit. Here is what makes this section truly tragic. Post tried to protect the palace by handing it to the one entity she believed could preserve it forever. The federal government. When that entity returned it, the palace fell into the most fragile phase of its existence. It became a monument without a role, a large body without a heartbeat. And when a monument loses its role, it becomes vulnerable to the oldest solution in real estate. Erase it. Start again. Build something that makes sense on a spreadsheet. Chapter 16, 1985. The deal that changed the meaning of the house. In 1985, Donald Trump entered the story. At the time, he was known primarily as a New York real estate developer with a taste for publicity and negotiation. He was interested in Palm Beach, and he recognized what the Post Foundation was facing: a costly asset under pressure. Trump understood leverage. Change the options, and you change the price. Accounts described tactics that discouraged other bidders and increased pressure on the seller. Whatever the details, the result was clear. A deal became possible. Trump acquired Mar-a-Lago in 1985, with many accounts placing the final handover in 1986. Reported figures are commonly described in the range of roughly $7 to $10 million, far below what many thought such a property should command. Reports often place the purchase in late 1985. However, the exact number matters less than what the deal signaled. Mar-a-Lago was no longer treated as a national symbol in waiting. It was treated as a distressed asset that needed a new plan. Trump did not simply buy a house. He bought a problem, and problems are where leverage lives. A palace that could not be carried by government or foundation money now had to pay for itself. Then came the second shift. Post had built Mar-a-Lago as a private instrument. Then she tried to make it a national instrument. Now it would become something else entirely. A commercial instrument. That is not a moral judgment. It is a description of survival. Because private clubs have something governments and foundations often do not. A built-in revenue model. Chapter 17. The business model that kept the lights on. After the purchase, restoration and change followed. A mansion that large cannot remain frozen. It must be repaired, updated, reworked, but more important than renovation was reinvention. By the mid-1990s, Mar-a-Lago was converted into a private club, a membership model, fees, events, a steady flow of paying guests. In 1995, the club model became the defining identity of the property. Guests could pay to enter the world that once belonged to a single heiress. Rooms that had hosted social power in the 1920s now hosted a business, and that business, unlike a dream, could be measured. Membership dues, event rentals, food service, guest rooms, all feeding the same purpose: keep the palace alive. In one sense, it was the most practical answer to the problem that haunted the estate for decades. A palace needs money to survive. Membership creates revenue. Revenue pays for staff, security, repairs, and the endless battle against coastal decay. In another sense, it was the sharpest irony of the entire story. Post tried to remove Mar-a-Lago from the marketplace by giving it to the nation, but the refusal threw it back into the marketplace, and the only way it survived was by becoming a product inside it. The house lived. The original moral meaning of the house changed. Not because anyone sat down and decided to insult Marjorie Post, because buildings follow economics the way water follows gravity. Chapter 18. What Mar-a-Lago took from its creator. So we return to the question from the opening. How did Mar-a-Lago ruin America's greatest heiress? It did not ruin her bank account. She died wealthy. She left art, institutions, foundations, and a legacy that extends far beyond one building. But ruin is not always financial. Sometimes it is narrative. Sometimes it is when the work you love most refuses to become what you meant it to be. Mar-a-Lago took three things from Marjorie Post. First, it took the ending she wanted. She tried to conclude her life with a national gesture that would preserve the palace as a public instrument of diplomacy. The government refusal turned that gesture into a historic rejection, a gift returned. Second, it took the permanence she was trying to purchase. The whole point of handing the estate to the federal government was to protect it from market forces and fragmentation. When the government returned it, the palace fell into the most vulnerable phase of its existence. Hard to sell, hard to fund, at risk of decay and demolition. Third, it took authorship. Post built Mar-a-Lago as a signature in stone. She shaped it with artists, with taste, with the logic of power. She attempted to attach that signature to the American state. When the palace moved on without her, her signature remained on the architecture, but the story attached to it shifted beyond her control. In tragedies, the hero often falls not because they were weak, but because they reached too high. Post reached for national meaning. She reached for a monument that would outlast her. She reached for a kind of immortality that required the future to cooperate, and the future never signs the contract. Chapter 19. The last image and the real lesson. Return to the Atlantic at dawn. The same pale light, the same salt air, the same barrier island, still caught between sea and lagoon. Mar-a-Lago still stands. Arches, courtyards, corridors, built for drama. From a distance, it looks like permanence. But if you listen to what the building has actually done, it tells a different truth. Wealth can build a monument. It cannot guarantee the monument's meaning. The hardest part of legacy is not creation. It is the handoff. Marjorie Merriweather Post wanted to leave America a place where presidents and diplomats could meet the world. Instead, her palace became evidence that even the richest woman in the country could not force history to honor her script. And that is why the opening line is not trivia. It is the whole story. A palace by the sea, a gift returned, a legacy rewritten by cost, security, and the cold mathematics of keeping the lights on. If you want a single sentence to explain why this story holds attention, it is this. Marjorie Merriweather Post built Mar-a-Lago to outlive her, and it did, but it outlived her by changing its purpose, its owner, and its meaning. That is the hardest kind of immortality, not disappearance. Transformation. One last detail completes the tragedy. Post did not fail because she lacked money or vision. She failed because she bet on something no individual can control. Institutional will. She assumed that if she offered a masterpiece, the nation would adopt it out of gratitude and pride. Instead, the nation treated it the way bureaucracies treat anything that does not fit a mission. As a line item, as a security problem, as a cost that could not explain itself, Mar-a-Lago still teaches that lesson. A monument can be built with private money, but it cannot be guaranteed a public purpose. And when purpose disappears, the market returns. Not gently, not politely. It returns like the tide. And